So welcome, Nathaniel and Chris.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Nat, it's a pleasure to be doing this with you. I haven't seen you in a long time, but you were once my boss many, many years ago. Or supervisor might be the right word.
I would say colleagues, yeah.
I'll take it. I confess that as someone who really likes reading about things that are books like this, I actually was totally unaware of this until NYRB's reissue came out of Storm. So I thought that would probably be the case for many of the people watching this tonight, and it might be a useful way to get started if you would just sort of say simply what this novel is, and maybe if you wanted to read a little bit of it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's a thrill to see you, Chris, and to join you, and to be with the people at Point Reyes books, which I've always read about and wanted to visit, and look forward to visiting in person one day. One of my favorite parts of the world, Point Reyes, and that part of the coast. So George Stewart is a fascinating figure, really a polymath. I mean, he taught at Berkeley and elsewhere, was a novelist. He wrote narrative nonfiction works. He also wrote this fascinating book called Names on the Land, which NYRB Classics previously published, which is actually was my first encounter with him, which is this fascinating sort of eccentric history of place names in America. But he also published this series of what are now considered these ecological novels, and it can be argued that the first ecological novels. Earth Abides is probably the best known. It's been never gone out of print. It was a huge bestseller in its time. These are published in the 40s and 50s. This really a quartet of novels. And it takes place in a sort of speculative future after the downfall of humanity. This book that we're here to discuss tonight, Storm, was also a huge hit in its time, but it's not surprising, I think, that you weren't familiar with it. I wasn't either. It has its it has a sort of small passionate fan base, but it wasn't well known. It sort of has been forgotten, although it is prescient. It does sort of prefigure what we're only now seeing in the literature around climate change and ecology some 80 years later. It was published in 1941, and it's essentially the biography of a storm called Mariah that hits the West Coast, does a fair amount of damage, although it's not really apocalyptic, although the early paperback covers would lead you to believe when it was published, it was sort of published as a kind of pulp style. But it's the story of this storm as it hits California and goes across, ultimately travels across the continent. And what's unique about it, in particular, is it's really the storm itself is the main character, is the protagonist, to a degree that's almost bizarre. In that and we'll discuss what I mean, I guess, by that in greater detail as we go forward. But the plot is really situated squarely around the path of the storm, and the characters in the book, the human characters, are almost incidental to that story. And so I'll read a couple pages from the beginning just to give, I think, any viewers the sense of the language, of the approach, and really this perspective that he takes to tell this story. This is from the second chapter called Second Day. As a crab moves on the ocean bottom, but is of the water, so man rests his feet upon the earth, but lives in the air. Man thinks of the crab as a water animal. Illogically and curiously, he calls himself a creature of the land. As water environs the crab, so air surrounds, permeates, and vivifies the body of man. If traces of noxious gas mingle with it, he coughs and his complexion turns deathly gray. If it becomes overcharged with water droplets, he gropes helplessly in fog. If it moves too fast, he becomes a pitiable, windswept creature, cowering in cellars and ditches. Even for rain, he is dependent on air. If actually removed from air, he dies immediately. Physicists describe the air as tasteless, odorless, and invisible. It could not well be otherwise, but these are not so much its qualities as adjustments of man. For if the air impressed the senses, being at the same time all pervasive, it would necessarily obscure all other tastes, odors, and sights. Air is so bound up with man's life that only with difficulty can he realize its existence as something in itself. To a savage, it is as much an abstraction as consciousness. A child can conceive wind, which is air in motion, but not air itself. In our own language, wind, mist, and rain are ancient words, but air is a late and learned borrowing of a Greek word, which itself originally meant wind. In his prenatal months, indeed, man is aquatic, but thrust forth into the atmosphere, small and red, he sucks in a first breath spasmodically and owes his allegiance to air. 70 years later, a nurse stands by an old man's bed waiting for what is known as, quote, the last breath. As individual men move in a too well-known landscape without noticing its features, so man, fallaciously, takes for granted the all-pervasive air. His historians deal in lands and seas, but most movements of peoples have not been so much quests for better countries as for better atmospheric conditions. Quote, a place in the sun explains much of history more exactly than we usually realize, except that just as often we should say a place in the rain. A thunderstorm in haytime may overthrow a ministry, and a slight average rise or fall of temperature may topple a throne. A shift in the storm track can ruin an empire. In the 20th century, a temporary variation of rainfall put Okies upon the highway by the 100,000, just as in the 3rd century, a similar shift might in a single year hurl the Huns against the Chinese frontier and set the blue-painted Caledonians swarming at Hadrian's wall. In the mass as in the individual, man is less a land animal than a creature of the air. I'll stop there, but I think that gives some sense of where he's coming from, coming from a cosmic perspective almost.
Yeah, I think that that's a great section to read because it contains so much of what the book contains, which is the sort of like contingency of human life on the weather and the ways in which that contingency is often invisible to us as we go about our lives, and also just the sort of the matter of like the etymological question of like what do we call this? Do we refer to wind or do we refer to air? I think touches on a big theme in the book, which is and a theme that you have written about kind of in numerous places elsewhere, about how do we talk about the environment? How do we write about ecology? And I wanted to share an anecdote that I briefly mentioned to you, but might be familiar to some of the people watching, which was that 2 years ago, before these things went online, there was an event for Richard Powers where he was talking about his novel Overstory, which was a mega runaway hit, and he got a great turnout in our local feed barn where these things used to be held. And you had written, I would say, a gently critical review of that book in the Atlantic, and seemed to irk Mr. Powers, and he sort of held you up after quoting a very small bit of the review, kind of used you as a straw man throughout his talk, or sort of foil, as the critic who thinks that the environment is not really like a suitable subject of fiction, which I know is not something you believe, not least of which because you wrote the introduction to this.
Not something I wrote either, but yeah, go on.
Yeah, exactly. Not something you wrote either. But I think that what you were thinking about in your review of Powers that I think is really germane to the issue of Storm is how do we write fiction about the weather? How do we write fiction about climate change? How do we write fiction about ecology? And this book, it's almost like you can see George Stewart thinking out loud in the book, like he keeps kind of changing tack in a very charming way. Like, how do I dramatize this? Do I need human characters? Can they totally disappear? And I thought it would be interesting for you to talk as someone who's written both critically of other people's work and in your own work about the status of sort of fiction and ecology, like what you think this novel has that maybe some contemporary so-called eco-fiction doesn't have.
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I think that's what a lot of writers are trying to figure out now, and you can see it, reading their work and reading these novels. What's you know, for Richard, you know, the overstory, there's this premise that Powers is telling, who's a writer I greatly admire, but in that novel, the premise is essentially that he's telling the story of the trees. He's speaking for the environment, and every character, there's something like 9 characters in that novel, all have sort of different sympathies different relationships with, you know, environmentalism, to put it broadly. When the novel begins, by the end, they're all tree obsessed and, you know, friends of the earth, and they've all dedicated their lives in some way to advancing environmental causes, conservation, reforestation, and so on. And what's striking about Storm is the main character really is a natural event. It's not characters who care about storms. It's the storm. You know, he goes as far as you can possibly go. I mean, it would be as if the overstory was told from the perspective of a tree. There are passages in that novel where he attempts to do something like that, and he personifies trees, and, you know, drawing on research from a real botanist who's now written her own memoir. But there are little passages of that. But this is full bore, and it's almost from a novelistic standpoint, from a writing standpoint, it's almost crazy. I mean, because you have he's basically violating the most, you know, fundamental law of writing fiction, which is that the character, the main character, goes through some kind of a journey, has some consciousness, has some character evolution, makes decisions, you know, has volition, and comes out the other side of the story in some, as, you know, a different person in some way. And this, and I'm, you know, of course, broadly generalizing about the form, but here he really tries to do that with this inanimate entity, and in order to pull it off, he has to push the sort of use of metaphor so far. Is one way of doing it. You know, Mariah becomes this creature, has a lifespan, has relationships, has a kind of sexuality, has sort of whims and desires, and it's all, he's always using metaphor, but he's you know, really describing it as a character. And then on the other side of the equation, the human characters are reduced to ciphers for the most part. It's a novel that has a ton of human characters, but they're all, for the most part, you know, they're all really minor characters, secondary characters. Some only appear on the scene for a couple of a paragraph or a chapter. There are others that recur, but in many cases they don't have names. They're just, you know, sort of a junior meteorologist is the closest thing to a main character. There's a load manager, you know, someone who's working power lines. And so he's taking this narrative experiment to a degree that I think would terrify most novelists. And it's really fascinating to see. No one's really tried it before. No one had tried it before or has tried it since. And so it's, you know, as fun and exciting as the story is, it's like watching this incredible high wire act, where he's trying to sustain this narrative about a character who's made out of wind. Right.
Yeah. Well, it seems like one of the things that allows him to pull that high wire act off is that I kept thinking about, like, what other writers he reminded me of, and I kept returning to John McPhee and also Aldo Leopold, neither of whom write fiction, but I mean, are not known for fiction, but have that very special gift, which is really all in the prose of imbuing kind of mundane things with, like, real charm or drama, or, you know, he could talk for 3 pages about how a snowplow works, and it's like you know, you're rooting for the snowplow by the end of those 3 pages. He can kind of imbue. The Aldo Leopold thing is more of a sort of ecological, like the sort of the seasons and the cycles of the year, and you become sort of hypnotized by it. But he can describe the minutia of how systems work with really vividly, especially particularly abstract systems like rising and falling pressure are not vivid visual things, and yet you start to feel the rise and the fall of storm fronts.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible in Storm that he's able to bring dramatic, not just sort of dramatic value, but excitement to as you say, it's the movement of air masses. I mean, it's sort of, when you step back, it's almost ridiculous. But in the reading of the novel, it works, and it's but it's striking on a novelistic level. It's also striking just in terms of, on an ecological level. If you remove it from just the history of the novel, there's really nothing like it in its time, or really for 2 generations after. But then even in the, you cited Aldo Leopold, there was really only a small group of people in this time that he's writing. This is the late 30s, early 1940s, that even think in ecological terms, even within sort of the world of naturalism and conservation, which is, what the kind of version of the environmental movement that was around in that period. The sense of all of this interrelationship of the natural world and the human world, and various aspects of the natural world. There was no such thing as climatology, for instance, in this time. There were decades before that term is used, and yet here he's linking together air masses, the oceans, the interaction of the storm and topography and all of the rest. Is a very contemporary understanding of these phenomena that even within sort of scientific realms was somewhat unusual.
Yeah.
And so you have to think that his experience, being at Berkeley and talking with specialists, he did a tremendous amount of research for the novel that must have helped him understand the storm in these ways. But I think the original glimpse of the story was simply as a metaphor. He had the idea of the storm as a woman, basically, and sort of striding across the land. Right. The other thing we should say is that it was Stewart's novel that gave the Weather Service the idea of naming storms in the first place. Storms didn't have names. Hurricanes didn't have names then, but it was his allegory that actually changed policy around how storms are technically discussed.
I saw today that Mariah had at some point been retired. It was in the cycle of names for a while, and it was retired after a particular deadly storm. I guess when a storm kills enough people, they stop using that name.
Yeah, exactly.
You won't be seeing a Katrina or anything like that for a while.
Yeah, they retired. But yeah, and I was very terrified recently because I'm in New Orleans, and Ida was almost Julian, which is one of my son's names, and so we were both afraid of the storm and afraid of having a cursed name. You can't be Katrina in New Orleans, anymore either as a person, let alone the storm. But yeah, but also just novelistically, it's so out there that nobody really tried to write not only a novel in this kind of vein, but really a novel about the subject matter for decades and decades after Stewart.
Yeah, I mean, I think in what you just said, one of the things that might make, again, this novel work as a sort of ecological novel at such an early time, and even the use of that term, is that he's not writing from what we would call an environmental standpoint. Like he's not advocating. I can probably safely assume that George Stewart was like a conservationist, but he's not advocating openly for any sort of conservation. There's not really a moral element to how he talks about the storm, and it as opposed to some other notable ecological novels that have a strong, are obviously advocating for a particular position. He has a somewhat neutral relationship to storm and to weather in general. And I thought it might be interesting to talk about. He draws a distinction in the book, and it's a distinction we maybe lose sight of when we talk about the climate a lot, is distinction between climate and weather. And the book is really about weather. He talks about the climate as a sort of precondition for the weather. But, you know, we spend a great deal of time now talking about the climate, and it's a term that we hear a lot, but the climate isn't what we ever really experience. I mean, to some extent it is, but really what we talk about when we talk about climate change is bad weather, you know, floods where you are, wildfires where I am, that's weather, not climate. And I think that the sort of like, not totally morally neutral, because there are characters, sketchy and minor though they may be in this book, who I would say are like the book clearly admires and those that the book clearly doesn't admire. There's some moral valence to the characters, but for the most part, he's not an environmentalist. The book might function as an environmental work insofar as it makes one understand the Earth as a unified ecological system, but it's not an environmental novel.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction. I mean, in part, it reflects the period that he's writing in, but one problem. I mean, you talked about the challenges that writers have, and it's true not only of novelists, but I think I find it in the nonfiction as well. In writing about the environment and about climate change in particular, is that the literature around these subjects has been so heavily dominated by activist writing, by which I mean, you know, writing that is intended to inspire readers to act, you know, to think in a certain way and to act in a certain way. And with a subject like climate change, you know, it makes sense, and it comes from a place of virtue usually, where it's, you know, typically most things, and this is true of, you know, again, fiction, nonfiction, journalism, memoir, most things written on the subject tend to be written to inform the reader, you know, inform the reader of the problem or some aspect of the problem, the facts of the matter, the science of the matter, the ramifications, and instruct the reader essentially on, well, you know, what can be done? Where do we go from here? What should we do? I think Richard Powers' novel is a good example of the kind of activist, sort of exemplary activist novel, in that it's every single plot line ends up in the same place, where it's informing the reader, you know, trees are important, biodiversity is important, conservation is important. Every character in the book sort of takes up arms to this cause, and the reader is in no uncertain terms is also expected to, you know, come around in some way. And it's only now I'm reading the new Joy Williams novel Harrow, which is so striking because it's such a rare example of not only is it not activist writing about climate change, but it's really anti-activist. It's sort of disgusted and would, you know, it's sort of the anti-Richard Powers. And Storm is it you know, it certainly predates climate activism, and, you know, even awareness really of at least awareness of the dangers of climate change by a couple decades. But you're right, it's not activist in any way, and in fact it reflects a very different strand of environmental thought that is no longer really broadly held, certainly not by sort of environmentalists, which is to say that it's a view of nature as godlike, far more powerful, you know, overwhelmingly powerful when compared to the activities of human beings.
Right.
In the novel, you know, human beings are treated they're almost like ants.
Yeah.
Their sort of anxieties and concerns are ridiculed and seen as so insignificant compared to these great natural forces and phenomena that he's writing about. It's almost like comic relief when you have these characters. And there's, I mean, I wrote in my introduction, you know, there's all these little descriptions of people where they're described as sort of pathetic animals, you know, like deer in the headlights idea when the storm is coming, and they're just these apes who can't comprehend the majesty of what's happening and the danger that they're in. And that's a very different view of these matters now that we're at a place where we're aware of how much not only how much damage we've done human beings through our activities and how recklessly, but the degree to which we've altered anything that could be considered natural about the planet, and so it's coming. The novel is written from a kind of an intellectual or even moral understanding of environmentalism that is a relic of the past at this point, which doesn't undermine it, but it actually gives it a sort of greater poignancy, I think, reading it. And I sort of, one wishes that we couldn't readjust the Gulf Stream through our activities, or that we couldn't cause storms to come more often and grow more deadly. But it's also part of the power of the book. It's that it's focused so heavily on the storm and on sort of natural processes that human beings come to seem sort of ridiculous. And what's interesting, I guess, to complete the thought, is with like the Joy Williams novel, I think we're kind of coming back around to that again, which not necessarily a sense of powerlessness, but almost it ends up in a place of kind of nihilism, where it's like we've gone too far. There's nothing we can, from we're so powerless to do anything, to exert any control over our fate, to we've gone so far in exerting control that we are now in a place where any attempt at mitigation or deliverance is absurd and not worth ridicule. And so it's interesting to see, and who knows where the literature will go, but that does represent, the Williams novel, it does represent a sort of interesting new approach that ends up sort of somewhere back where George Stewart was, in a way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he does. I would say that, just to clarify a little on like the description of humans as ants, like that's true. And there seem to be, like, within the book, there are like two kinds of ants. There's in fact, he often puts the two kinds of ants side by side, which is like, they'll show like a businessman whose phone connection to New York from San Francisco is cut off for 4 seconds and like flies into a rage, simultaneously showing like some heroic linemen in the snow climbing a pole to fix it, and how amazing it is their connection was restored in 10 seconds through all of labor and ingenuity. And so there's these kind of like, I mean, it's of its time that they're all sort of like gruff, no nonsense working men who solve the problems, and everyone else just kind of sits helplessly by. But he does divide humanity into like people who confront the storm and know that they can't overpower it, but sort of work with it, and then the rest of us idiots who are like, why isn't my water hot enough? And
yes, that's a good
cockpit is heroically getting the plane over the Sierras, and in the back people are like, geez, this flight's going to be late.
That's a good point. I mean, you're right. There's also a kind of, which also feels very much of the 30s, and I mean, this is published in 1941, of that period of a sense of vitality from proximity with the real world, and that the denatured businessmen, or the CEOs who are furious because the line flickers in and out on the phone call to Chicago, do come to seem sort of they're emasculated, and they're the most buffoonish in a way.
They're the bad guys. You definitely despise them in their ending.
So I suppose you could say in that there is sort of there is a moral argument there embedded in it, and you see this in the rest of his work. He wrote a great book about the Donner Party, as well, narrative nonfiction, that we've come too far from primitive nature, that we've traveled too far away from who we really are, and we risk losing our identity as a result.
Yeah, I've lost you for a moment, but I'm sure you'll come back. I think that one of the things in that distinction between different types of characters that I realize is that the book, in addition to being about the weather, is in places kind of like a love poem, and I think that section you read hints at, but doesn't fully capture the extent to which the book is just a deeply poetic, lyrical piece of writing. But there is a sort of like love affair with man-made systems, which he describes as being sort of puny, but things like the interstate highways and the power lines and the system of levees and weirs and dams that control the storms in the Central Valley of California and into the Bay Area. He's clearly just in love with those accomplishments, and it really comes through in the book.
Yeah, there's a lyricism about the natural world, not just the storm itself and these complex processes, but he has this whole long thing about the life of an ancient tree and the various life phases that really belongs in the tradition of Aldo Leopold, John Muir, and then going past them into a sort of an Annie Dillard and John McPhee, and there's a sense of glory and beauty, and not just these massive phenomena, but in these extremely slow building phenomena. I mean, the decay of a tree over centuries is one of the most beautiful parts of the novel. Is he returns to it. This tree itself becomes a character in the novel, and its different uses, at different forms, at different phases of its life cycle. It feels a lot like Aldo Leopold, and it's not the kind of thing you often encounter in fiction of that period, or really fiction generally.
Yeah, sometimes he's almost sort of dryly humorous with it. Like there's this sort of like focus on one small thing. There's like this Rape of the Lock style epic saga about a 2x4 that's sitting by the side of the road, and early in the book, you see the 2x4 bounce out of a truck, and then later you see it kind of slide a little into the road, then some manure falls on it. And that this 2x4 is going to like perform some narrative function at some point. But it's just such a wonderful book. But how he instills these, not just mundane, but tiny things, a little piece of lumber by the side of the road with sort of epic narrative force that almost rivals like the globe sweeping storm that is the 2x4 and Mariah, the storm, are at some point sort of like equal as forces that are going to cause a death or whatever they end up doing.
Yeah, and I think it's striking that the storm itself, as destructive as it is, he also goes out of his way to explain that it's not actually, it's not the world's biggest storm. It's not apocalyptic. It's actually just a bad storm like many others that passes over the continent, and the ordinariness of it is itself part of the beauty of it. That he's appreciating the world as it is. He doesn't have to go into some kind of apocalyptic science fiction reality. That's another lesson I think that is starting to be learned in contemporary climate fiction, which I think the first novels, just like the first films that we've seen on the subject, tend to be, disaster novels or dystopian novels, and that take place after, the apocalypse, after the world has been burned up, or we're in some water world scenario, and I think it's actually that feels to me a kind of entry level way of understanding this great public crisis. But I think as the literature's maturing, we're seeing more novels that don't just go to the worst possible scenario, but deal with the eeriness of the present or future realities that are close enough to the present that they seem familiar, even if there's some things that have been altered.
Yeah, and the lived experience of climate change is not going to be one big storm. It's going to be,
you know,
more and more of what we're currently experiencing.
Yeah.
I'm going to interrupt you because it's on point. Someone has just asked, Cynthia Roderick has asked, can you mention a climate change crisis novel that you think works and why it works? Which maybe you already have to some extent.
Yeah, there's a few examples. There's not as many as I think there will be, but I mean, some recent examples that come to mind, Alexandra Kleeman's new novel, Something New Under the Sun, I believe it's called. I'm sure it's at the bookstore there, is a good example of a novel that takes place in California, slightly in the future, or a slightly alternative reality, where water in California has been privatized. You can only buy a sort of water, a corporate water that is sold, that has some eerie properties that over the course of the novel are sort of become increasingly sinister. But it's a kind of wildfire ravaged California, but everything else is mostly the same. And the story itself is about celebrity. It's about a novelist who has come to LA to become a screenwriter, and sort of disastrous results, and his relationship with this young starlet. There's the link, Something New Under the Sun. And so the story itself is not really about climate change, but it's haunted by climate change. It's all around the story. I mean, you could say in some way it's about climate, but it's not really, and it certainly is not activist. It's not trying to get you to conserve water or anything. But it captures the eeriness of this moment, and the sense of foreboding that I think we all feel, that you certainly feel every wildfire season.
Yeah.
I think of there's a couple early examples that always come to mind. T.C. Boyle's novel Friends of the Earth, which also moves between sort of present and a future, slightly post-apocalyptic, and reality that is like all this stuff is really about the relationships of the people, these wild characters, and yet it's not. And then there's there's a character based on the girl who was in the tree, actually based on the same character that then Richard Powers uses in
Julia Butterfly.
Julia Butterfly, yeah. T.C. Boyle already had done that in a novel. I don't know if Powers had read it. So there's that character, and but it's not at all preachy, and it's creepy and weird and comic and bizarre. It's not necessarily his best novel, but it captures, I think, some of the sense of dread and a desire to do something to right these wrongs, but also the futility of a lot of these characters, who can't get out of their own way to do it. I think of Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation is a novel that's part of this trilogy. It's made into a film that does a nice job of both. I think of capturing the weirdness of the moment and a sense of dread and a sense of guilt that we have but can't ever quite atone for, because the destruction is so vast, and so much of it was done before our time. And so I think there's a literature that's emerging, and that's growing more robust as the years come along. But I wonder if it takes sort of a younger generation of writers to really grapple with it in a deeper way than we've seen it before. I mean, I think a lot's changed in the last 5 or 10 years, but it's felt like part of the problem is that a lot of novelists, the few novelists that were taking it on, were interested in the subject matter, but don't have the same sort of personal stakes in it as a young person. That's sort of the reality of climate change, that there are real generational shifts. Doesn't mean an older person can't write a wonderful novel about it, but I think the reason it hasn't been more of a robust, my pet theory is that part of it has to do with just one of the reasons is that it takes a generation of writers who knows that this is their reality, this is their life, this is their future that they're writing about, to get at some of the deep, the deeper unsettling qualities of it.
Yeah, I think it's worth, on the heels of you talking about what is and might be good sort of eco or climate change fiction, it's worth mentioning that you yourself have written in various ways about the climate, but you have also, I think, quite rightly and quite emphatically written, among other places in that Richard Powers review in The Atlantic, that the problem of climate change is not that we don't have a good way of talking about it. Like, there's not like a perfect infographic or a perfect type of novel that will make people fully understand what carbon is doing to the atmosphere and change policy. And like, it's a sort of meta fight that we can have because it's easier to argue about literature than it is to argue about environmental policy. So we can sort of obsess about like, what is the right way to talk about the climate, as if we find it, that will actually solve things. But you said yourself that sort of like the problem here is not misinformation. It's not poor storytelling. It's something much graver and much more fundamental.
Well, there's two separate problems that usually tend to get conflated. I mean, one is the activist problem of struggling to motivate individuals and, more broadly, our politics, to act. Right. And that's a real problem. How do you talk to people who don't care? How do you talk to people who are denialists? How do you talk to politicians who have all these other interests? How do you move the needle politically? That's one conversation. A second conversation is how do you write well about it, and in what form? And I would argue that the novel, there is a tradition of activist novels. I don't think they've, I guess Uncle Tom's Cabin is sort of the big example that people would put forward as one that is perceived as changing popular opinion. I think that's debatable, but ultimately, a great novel is, I don't want to paraphrase, I don't want to misquote Saul Bellow, but he has this line about, the great and the best novels, you have opposite interests, opposite desires competing, equally represented and in some kind of battle with each other. And the tension of the novel and of the story comes out of that battle. And in a novel where, in an activist novel, it's all one-sided. It's all on one side. You're trying to get people to see the light, and other people. And I think that the challenge of climate for writing, I don't think it's the job of the novelist to convince denialists that they should be voting for the Green New Deal. I think there is something for a novelist to say about, to ask at least about, well, how is this great public crisis changing us? How is it affecting our personal lives, our private lives? How does it enter into our inner, sanctum in ways that go beyond just having to evacuate a hurricane or a wildfire? What's it doing to our culture? What's it doing to the way we think about our families and so on? And that the intersection between this public drama and the private drama is something that I feel like has not been addressed sufficiently yet in the literature. It's changing, but that's a rich and deep well to draw from, and that's where I think novelists can have something to say and can make a real contribution, because I think these are questions that a lot of us struggle with, and I think through fiction and through great literature is one way we have of helping ourselves to think more clearly about these questions.
Yeah, and to return to Storm, I think that's something that this does. I mean, in a small and, as you rightly pointed out, now somewhat obsolete way, but you draw the analogy in your wonderful introduction between Storm and the famous photograph of the whole Earth from 1968 from the Apollo 8, which is sort of often credited. It's the image on the cover of the Whole Earth catalog and now on a million flags, and it is credited sort of with launching the environmental movement. I think Storm accomplishes something similar in that it, in a somewhat neutral way, the Apollo 8 photographer was not attempting to put his thumb on the scale of public opinion, but the sight of the entire globe did something to the human mind, theoretically. Maybe it didn't do enough to the human mind, but in much the same way, Storm, without advancing any particular moral cause and without sort of setting up cartoonish oil lobbyists and heroic conservationists, you can't finish the book without having a slightly more vivid sense of the Earth as like a system, and ecology as something within, that we live within, that's not distinct from us.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something moral about that. Jasper,
right.
Sorry.
Yeah, yeah. There's something moral about that. It feels incidental to me. It's like moral in the same way that like witnessing a crime might do something to your own morality. It's not. It doesn't set out to achieve that end. Maybe. I mean, maybe it did, and I'm not giving George Stewart enough credit as a conservationist as he then would have been called.
No, I mean, I think that's what makes it so valuable, and that's what I think elevates it to art, is that he doesn't have a hobby horse, right? He doesn't have an agenda, but he has this incredible subject that no one has before him has written about, or has written about well, and certainly not dramatically. And so I think there's something actually heroic about a novelist trying to take this on and trying to negotiate between the movement of air masses over oceans and landscapes, and trace that exactly into the lives of these really hundreds of characters. I mean, one of the most I think beautiful passages is about there is a kind of Rube Goldberg order of operations here, where it's like the butterfly effect basically is playing out, but yeah, the movement of this one breeze causes, he traces it to not just a drop phone call, but because of the storm, a woman can't say goodbye to her mother on her deathbed, or this one couple, this young lovers, instead of going safely to their destination and being married and having a family, are killed. Or there are subtler things. There's a divorce. Someone is going to reconsider, I think, filing a divorce, but then the phone call can't get, and they end up getting divorced as a result. And so I think there's something very beautiful about that, and it's very difficult. You can see Stewart working on the page. It's not frictionless. You can see how he has to these incredible lengths that he has to go through in order to make it work dramatically, but he succeeds, and there's something heroic about it, and I think there's morality in that, in a writer telling a story for the first time, telling it well, and really tackling this problem in the subject matter in this form for the first time, is a beautiful thing to witness as a reader.
Yeah. It is uncanny. Like it doesn't jump out as a work of high nonfiction, but it actually is an extremely weird piece of writing. There's chapters that are like 2 sentences, and it'll be like a snatch of sort of Old Testament Blakean poetry, and then we're back with like a guy trying to fix the snowplow. But he changes register from this like real aw shucks kind of Steinbeck Californian working man's very, very simple prose to these like flights of sort of Victorian Shakespearean poetry. It's kind of amazing. I one of the things that he's so prescient in so many things, and it's kind of shocking the way this predicts what will come. One of the places that his prophecy falls really short, and I thought is interesting and worth talking about, he gives like a 10,000 year history of man's ability to learn how the tide works. From like, some of it is kind of problematic about savages like throwing babies into the river and whatnot to appease the river gods, but he tells a plausible story of how we came to understand the tide, and says in 1937, probably 100 years hence, this will be our relationship to the weather. Like we now stand where the primitive man stood 3 centuries earlier. So, and I think it was very reasonable reading this book to think in 1937 to think in 100 years, sure, we'll have that much more data. There'll be weather centers everywhere. The math will be better, and we'll be able to predict the weather with the precision in which in 1937 they could predict the tides, something that hasn't changed at all in nearly 100 years. So it really, first of all, I don't know enough about meteorology to realize like why that has been an insoluble problem. I think it has something to do with like chaos theory and the math. The math is too hard. It's not the lack of data.
Well, I'll give my brief. I mean, in some ways he's right, and he was right before a major milestone in meteorological history. I mean, in this period, you have this sort of modernization and really the creation of modern meteorology, I guess. There's Jule Charney is the figure that's most credited with being the godfather of modern meteorology, the person who makes weather predictable, although obviously it's not as predictable as it could be. And what's interesting is that in connection to the storm is he's also a figure, Charney, who had this decisive role to play in the history of climate change. It was he was the person, because he was so respected and distinguished, he was asked by the Carter administration to write a report, later known as the Charney Report, that was really the crystallization of the science around climate change in 1979, and is the moment in which basically everything we know about climate change today was understood and codified. And so Stewart, yes, he was maybe a little overly optimistic, but he was actually right before a kind of revolution in the science that would, and with that revolution would come greater sophistication and understanding of climate change itself.
Right. Interesting. Well, we still don't know precisely what the weather will be next.
No, we do not.
And I think that if we did, that would really change our relationship to climate change. What I was leading was that some of the uncertainty that clings to the weather really affects our sense of whether anything can be done about it, whether it's worth trying to do anything about it. I think there's a lot of people who exist somewhere on the spectrum between straight up climate denialism and Green New Deal, and they occupy a space of like, who can say what we could possibly accomplish? I think that's a fairly common relationship to the issue of climate change. And I wonder if we could say precisely what the weather would be next year, how that would actually affect our relationship to the climate.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's in his one of the striking things about the novel is he's not just taking a continental view, but it's global, and as you said, there's this sort of literary representation of the famous photograph of the Apollo, and it ends in that way, out in outer space, and that idea is now, we now take for granted, basically. Right. I mean, global warming, the idea of a global environment, but that even in that, he's really a couple decades ahead of the broader scientific community. It's 1957. That's the International Geophysical Year, was this major event when scientists from around the world started to work together to understand some of questions of meteorology and climate and the oceans, and it was also the beginning really of the modern space race, and it was also the beginning of the monitoring of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It comes out of that year. Roger Revelle, California scientist, who was the visionary, one of the visionaries who saw the importance of that, and so that even in that regard, the book is so ahead of its time, but it's easy to forget how advanced it was in the intellectual history reading it today, because now we take so much of this for granted.
Yeah. I see that we're supposed to be wrapping up. I wanted to see if anyone had more questions, and make a plug for the book, especially in the audience, the catchment basin of the Point Reyes books. This is a real, it is a global book, but the bulk of the action takes place in the Bay Area, and there's a wonderful portrait of sort of older San Francisco, and in fact, Point Reyes itself even gets a little very brief shout out. So I think there'll be a lot for people around here to enjoy, and also obviously everywhere else. But if there are no further questions, Emily, hello, welcome back.
Well, thank you both so much. Yeah, and if you haven't gotten a chance, you can, there's that green by storm button at the bottom. And we'll get this up on our YouTube channel, hopefully in a timely manner. But if you also want to share it with anyone, you can rewatch it here on the Crowdcast page. And thank you both for such an interesting conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nat, for doing this. It's
my pleasure.
It's
yeah. I hope more readers can discover Stewart, and maybe they'll bring out the book he wrote after this, Fire, about wildfires in California. We could do it again.
Yeah, that would be even more popular in this neck of the woods at this time of year.
Exactly. Thank you all out there for joining us also.
Have a great night. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.